Okay, so as we're preparing to bring Viva on, I would like to remind you this is the
All right. Well, I think I lost. I don't know if you guys are listening to me now. I lost the person I was listening to. Hold on a second. Well, you're watching me. All right, people. All right. Well, I think I lost. Hold up. Well, say good morning, everybody. I would have liked to have been there in person, except the flight was delayed, and then things got too complicated. This has been something of an amazing journey. I say from an outsider following this, and certainly from a Canadian following this in the States. I was watching on January 6th live with Robert Barnes, and we had been following all of the so-called election challenges, the lawsuits that were filed, the 60 plus lawsuits that were all dismissed because of how clean and proper that 2020 election was. We had followed it for years, but leading up to that. And so January 6th, in as much as it was not an insurrection whatsoever, but an absolute Fedsurrection, which we've all learned since that time, was the culmination of dereliction of duty of the systems that facilitated and allowed that whatever it was, I would call it less violent than some hockey riots that I have personally been to and photographed. It started with the courts abdicating their duties to adjudicate legitimate grievances. The courts ran and ducked and dismissed on standing, dismissed on latches. The one Trump case that was ever really heard on anything meaningful of the merits, in Georgia, where they never did any meaningful signature verification at all, despite what everyone thinks they did not in fact do. So January 6th was a culmination of events that started with the dereliction of duty of there's a lot of news going on in Canada, by the way. Justin Trudeau just resigned, so my phone is going a little crazy. It was the culmination of the systems not doing what they were supposed to do to address grievances. We were watching January 6th as it unfolded. Robert Barnes, I make my joke, partner-in-law, was supposed to be down on the Capitol, wasn't. He was on the outskirts of DC the day of. And in as much as it was immediately weaponized into the term insurrection, and how I call it the Mockingbird media, all unanimously started running with the insurrection narrative. And I only appreciated what they were getting at in retrospect. Insurrection, so they went for another impeachment 2.0. Insurrection, so they went for prosecuting and persecuting the grannies, but also anybody who engaged in some violence that day, to prosecute and persecute your political rivals, to discredit them, to turn them into domestic terrorists, to weaponize the system against half of America. We saw this happening live. And we were jokingly saying, all right, people you have a lot of people there. Some people are going to misbehave. When they started running with the insurrectionist narrative, we knew that there was something bigger and broader to this. And what they've done with that since has been nothing but the most egregious injustice that I've seen in my lifetime. I was moderating a panel at Mar-a-Lago on the lawfare. And we had on there, you had Michael Flynn, who was the victim of lawfare for nearly a decade now. You had Rudy Giuliani, victim of lawfare. You had Jeff Clark. You had John Eastman, who put out the new his documentary, The Eastman Dilemma, victims of the lawfare. And we've seen how they have weaponized this to persecute their rivals and it's not a two-tier system of justice. It's outright injustice. And at first, when we said, there was some violence there, people should get the punishments that they deserve for having transgressed certain, lines in the sand as relates to violence. Okay. When it became clear that this was nothing shy of what we'll call a Fedsurrection. It's either a Lee-hop, let it happen on purpose, a me-hop, made it happen on purpose. What this clearly was a made it happen on purpose from the highest levels down, so that they could weaponize it and lawfare it to terrorizing a population into being deterred from exercising their God-given constitutional right to protest. That's clearly what it was at the very least. When you find out that it was dereliction of duty from the top down, weaponizing from the top down for the purposes of then trying to impeach Trump a second time, strike him from the ballot 3 years later, strike people from office, Coy Griffin, just remove him from office for insurrection. It's that self-executing provision of the Constitution, as we now know. it became clear what it was. And then as the information came out as to what was done, what was facilitated by the dereliction of duty, the not having security, sufficient security, not accepting the National Guard, what we know Yogananda Pittman knew and failed to act on, understaffing for police officers, and then provocation of an angry group of protesters. You can call them a mob if you want to use hyperbolic rhetoric. What you had were patriots who were disenfranchised and enraged at the dereliction of duty from the bottom up, the top down, courts ducking and hiding, and you had a crowd that was there to air legitimate grievances that were then, as we now know, fired upon by the police, the minimal police that were there. Rubber bullets, tear gas, provocation. They were literally trampled to death in the case of Roseanne Boyland, literally summarily executed, Ashley Babbitt by Officer Byrd. And the crowd that was there airing legitimate grievances were beaten and provoked into what some resorted to violent responses or self-defense, depending on your perspective. And so at first, as you know, we were living through the information as it trickled out at the time, I said, look, pardon all of the non-violent Jan 6ers. I'll put non-violent in quotes because violence can be justified violence depending on the circumstances. So we'll have to put non-violent in quotes. And then when it became clear that even those who partook in violence, whether or not it was self-defense is a question of perspective, whether or not they were provoked, whether or not they were fighting for their own lives, or whether or not they were bona fide people who went a little bit too far. I'm setting aside the agitators, the non-violent agitators like Ray Epps, and then the violent agitators, the ones in black locks and still remain unaccounted for, some of them mysteriously. It became clear that even those who may have transgressed certain lines of the law never received any fair due process, never had their constitutional rights protected in the process. The defendants were not tried where they could have otherwise been in their hometowns of residence. They were tried in DC. They were tried in a jurisdiction where 95% of the jury of their peers think that they are insurrectionists, violent, terrorists, white nationalists, Nazi, whatever, Trump supporters. They were tried in an area, in a jurisdiction where the judges felt personally attacked by the insurrection that was manufactured on that day. None of them received due process. None of them received any fair treatment. There was evidence that was withheld. I said this on my channel a number of times. People try to fault Jake Lang for still being in prison because he postponed his trial. And I'm sitting there saying, you expect someone to rush to trial when they haven't had all of the evidence that is otherwise exculpatory evidence disclosed to them? You expect someone to rush to trial when the legitimacy of the charge against them hasn't yet been adjudicated by the courts? You want to wrongly charge, wrongly incarcerate, wrongly deny bail, and then force people to go to trial without the full evidence, and then fault them for having delayed that? You've got to be out of your mind. And even if they had committed the violence that some people think they committed, unprovoked, unwarranted, no self-defense, no justification whatsoever, what is the fair punishment? We're not dealing with a proper system anymore where 5 illegal immigrants can beat the ever-loving piss out of a New York police officer and then get bail the same day, no cash bail from what I understand, where others, in as much as you might even equate the conduct, which I won't, but I will for the sake of the thought experiment, are in jail pretrial detention for 4 years. It's insanity. It's abusive insanity. And Dershowitz, it wasn't Dershowitz, it was Giuliani at the lawfare panel said, this will go down in history as the same treatment of the Japanese Americans who were interned because they were deemed to be a domestic threat back in World War II. This will go down as that, but maybe even worse. I mean, we know of the conditions, the solitary confinement, the psychological torture that has driven many of I would say not many, a meaningful number of Jan 6ers to take their own lives. This will go down as dirty as what was done to Japanese Americans who were interned back in World War II. And so the bottom line, whether or not you think rightly or wrongly that there were some violent offenders on the Capitol that day, every norm of constitutional law, every norm of civil respect has been violated in the persecution of everyone. Enrique Tarrio is sitting in jail for 22 years for conspiracy. What was it? Seditious conspiracy? A man who didn't even step foot on the. It's insanity. And so you have punishments that do not fit the crime in as much as any crime was committed, a process that violated every right from beginning to end. And there's no way to parse it out to say non-violent Jan 6ers get pardoned, commuted, whatever. But the violent one will have to go one. No, you had the one chance to do justice along the lines of justice, and the system blew it. The system abused of it, and they don't get a second kick at the can. So the bottom line, I might have been a little slow to this Because in the beginning, I was saying, pardon the non-violent, and then you have to deal with the violent, so-called violent Jan 6. It's too late for that. It has been a systematic abuse of what would otherwise be normal constitutional rights violated by a weaponized, corrupt Department of Justice under the Biden regime. It has to be blanket pardons across the board, and it has to be loud enough so that Trump hears it and can't try to walk it back, try to temper it and say, I'll please both sides by pardoning the nonviolent, and we'll go one by one. No, too late. They had their chance. If you thought the person was guilty and you went out of your way to frame them, too bad. You'll have to, I don't want to equate any Jan 6er to O.J. Simpson, but if you frame a guilty man, you don't get to say, well, he was guilty anyway. You should have done your job properly from day one. They didn't. They abused it from day one, and it's got to be blanket pardons for all Jan 6ers. And a little side note for Chase Upmore, a man who had his house raided as a result of his participation in January 6th, and then got other charges that were not related to January 6th that he has to deal with now. Anything that resulted from those abusive raids and the abusive prosecutions in January 6th, incidental to it, is the fruit of a poison tree, and it must all be pardon blankets across the board January 20th. And maybe Trump, and hopefully Trump will hear this and not try to split the baby in half and say nonviolent, you get pardons, and the violent, you don't. No. When you split the baby in half, you don't please both sides, you kill the baby. Blanket pardons for all Jan 6ers. Thank you very much for having me. I would have loved to have been there in person, but nature is what it is.
Okay. Thank you so much, Viva. We appreciate that. That was powerful. I think we can all agree